We should have some music here. Oh, are we on already? Oh, never mind. I've been making three-dimensional birds from flat sheet using a modified spiculum method since 2007. In this video, I'll show you how it's done, starting with a clay model. Then to determine the shape I need to cut out of the sheet metal, I'll use a method that I'll show you in a minute. It starts with heating up a pot of dip seal to a liquid, which you will also see shortly. Dip seal is a waxy, rubbery substance intended as a protective coating and is available from industrial suppliers. I get mine from McMaster Carr. The same method that I use for the birds can be used for other things like slugs, which I've made quite a few of, and fish, snakes, a lot of things I haven't tried yet, and even a man in the moon. There's the dip seal and the cooking pot. It melts at 375 Fahrenheit and takes quite a while, so I can make the whole clay model while I'm waiting for it to melt. And there it is, ready to go. Now I push a thin metal rod through the clay model, pulling the angled end just under the surface of the clay and smoothing it off. I bent the other end into a handle to make it easier to hold on to, and also can hang it up to get it out of the way. Once it has been dipped and pulled out of the dip seal, it solidifies almost immediately. Now, after I decide where I want the seams to be, and the seams will be also the perimeter of the pattern, I mark where I want it to be cut with a Sharpie. Then with a sharp knife, carefully cut through, following the lines, then straightening the rod so it can be pulled out, and then remove the dip seal skin. Now for a pattern, I take a piece of paper, I'm using cardstock, and put a fold in it, then spread it back out on a flat surface. Now very carefully I spread the dip seal pattern out onto the paper, careful to line up the center line with the fold on the paper, then trace around it with a pencil. Now I fold the paper in half again and cut on the line with scissors to get a nice symmetrical shape. Now I'm tracing around the paper pattern with a Sharpie on 16 gauge brass. I could use copper, but I chose brass because that's what I'm most used to. Then cutting out with power shears, finishing up with a throatless shear. Then smooth the edges on a belt sander, and finally with a finer belt, chamfer the edges. These processes could be done other ways, and with smaller pieces, a jeweler's saw and files might be preferable. Now for annealing. For brass, I use a fire scale preventer, this Royal Tiger flux, mixed with alcohol. Unlike most other brazing fluxes which are granulated, this is a nice fine powder which mixes easily with rubbing alcohol and can be brushed on. After it's brushed on, it's annealed with a torch, then put in a warm pickle, and it comes out looking clean as new. Next, with the paper pattern, I find the center of the piece and mark the center line on both sides. I use a metal etching pen. It remains visible even after annealing. Then I make guide marks for raising, which wouldn't really be necessary if it was a smaller piece. I'm using the hydraulic press for the head of the bird. It could be done other ways without a hydraulic press, but this is easier and I've got it, so I may as well use it. It's punched on a polyurethane block, which leaves the edges ruffled, going down where they should go up, but it's easily corrected on a sandbag with a hammer, and on the same domed punch held vertically in the stake holder. Next it's hammered on the raising stake, and when it can't be worked anymore, it's annealed and pickled. Okay, starting stage 2, where most of the progress toward completion will be made. First, I heavily planish the head, which will work hard in the metal so that when the rest of it gets bent around, it won't narrow the head drastically. Then I work on the transition between the head and the rest of the body. Now, with the ball stake, I can use the heavy planishing hammer to planish and further form the compound curvature of the belly. You can see when I get down near the end, the metal gets ruffly. That's a sign that the metal is compressing where it has already been hammered, as it should be. Hammering those ruffles down at the end will complete the process. Now, holding it up and looking at it endwise, you can see the curvature that has been formed, and visualize it as a closed form. The critical part is the belly. It has to curve around a full 180 degrees when it's closed up, and I can tell by looking at this that it is not quite there yet. But it looks like one more round of planishing forming should do it, so I anneal it again. I have a slightly smaller ball on the stake this time to effect a tighter curvature. I'm planishing the head and working on differentiating the beak from the rest of the head and getting the belly to its required curvature. Then using a straight stake, smoothing the transition from beak to belly, which ideally would be a continuous straight line. Now you can see how much closer it's getting to closure. The belly looks like a full 180 degrees. A little more closing with a mallet and then closing up the beak on a stake, getting the seam closed down to the neck area. That's as far as I dare go for now. Since it's a butt seam, any forcing will cause one half to overlap the other, which requires a lot of tedious remedial measures. Setting it up for silver soldering, I use a screw clamp with a U-shaped piece of brass to protect the piece from the clamp. I coat it all with the fire scale protective flux just as I showed in the first annealing. Then applying a liquid flux to the seam. For copper I would have used a paste flux for this. I'm using wire solder threaded through a piece of rigid tubing to make it easier to handle. After the soldering is done, I anneal the rest of the piece. Okay, it's been pickled. Let's see how it looks. There's a gap in the solder. I'll close that up by hammering the metal on either side against this little stake, then hammering on the sides of the head and then with another stake. That worked to close it up. I'll re-solder it when I solder more of the seam. Now on to get more of the seam closed. More hammering all around. Then the big persuader, the vise, using 2 pieces of polyurethane for padding. This gets it almost completely closed, but only gets another inch of the seam closed perfectly enough to silver solder. So here I am silver soldering more of the seam. After that, just a few taps with the hammer and it's ready to do the final soldering of the seam. Now on to silver soldering the rest of the seam. After pickling, I'm working on shaping the tail. This pulled the seam apart a little bit right at the base, so I had to do more hammering to get the seam back together and settle for the tail being not exactly the way I wanted it. Here I am resoldering the seam where it got pulled apart. This is the last time I have to put the torch to it. Yay! Well, look at that. The tail is twisted. Those 2 polyurethane blocks and the vise come in handy. Some heavy-handed twisting takes care of the problem. Oh, now I'm going to use a special stake that I made just recently. Got to work on the tail some more, hammering on both sides to smooth out irregularities. Now I use a Scotch-Brite type wheel to remove any wayward solder and smooth the seam. Then polish it up all over with a 3M bristle wheel. This makes it easier to see what's happening while I'm doing the final planishing. Then working on the beak, refining the shape and making smooth transition from beak to head, from head to neck, and neck to body. Then a lot of planishing to get it nice and smooth all over. Back again to a Scotch-Brite wheel to get some solder spots I missed previously and smooth up the beak. Then a little more work on the tail, then on to the buffing wheel. After buffing and cleaning up, I'm going to call it done. Later on, when I have the time, I'll make a perch for it. There's the clay model again. The final piece doesn't look exactly like it. It looks better. Thank you for watching. You all have a safe trip home now.